Okay, I think we are going to get started now. My name is Craig Moss. I'm with the Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade, and with me today we have Martin Whitehead from PwC in Brazil. We're going to be talking.
Hi, everybody.
We're going to be talking to you today about corruption in third parties, and really help you to think about ways that you could start to mitigate your risks. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available for you to distribute within your companies or to third parties that you deal with. And also we'll be distributing the slides to those people that are attending. So with that, let me turn it over to Martin, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Craig, and let me also welcome everybody who's joining. It's great to have you with us, and I very much hope that the session that we've got today is a very topical subject for us in Brazil, as we know, and hopefully there'll be some practical insights and some useful tips and ideas coming through. So I've got a slight problem seeing the slides at the moment. If we move to the slide with the agenda, the way we're structuring the discussion is really, I can see that now, which is fine. Yeah, so we've got three areas. So we'll very quickly run through and just set as a context and as a baseline, really, some of the things that we know are happening in our region, particularly in Brazil. And that really, if you like, makes the case as to the realism as to why is everything so important that we're talking about in terms of corruption and the risk, particularly with third parties. And so we'll talk about, what are the elements really of how do you go about having an effective program? What are the elements? And then we'll get onto the really meat, if you like, the meat of the discussion.
Hello? Martin, are you there? I think we've lost. Andy, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. While Martin reconnects, I'm going to just take over and I'll move it ahead from here. So as he was saying, we're going to dig into the elements of an effective program. And this is an area where we'll provide you with some real practical guidance on some things that you might consider doing. And then finally, dig into a little bit more about risk assessment, due diligence, and monitoring. First, a little background on CREATE. CREATE is a global NGO. We focus on helping companies to protect intellectual property and trade secrets and prevent corruption in their global supply chain, both internally but also with the third parties they deal with. We have developed programs from working with leading companies and universities around the world, and we're active in quite a few key markets around the world, as you can see. PwC, Martin will jump in when he gets back on, but PwC is a global consultancy. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They help organizations and individuals create value. They have firms in 157 countries. They're really one of the large leading firms in this field. And what we have done, CREATE and PwC Brasil have teamed up to come up with a effective entry-level product for helping companies to understand where they are now with preventing corruption, what kind of systems they have in place, and to build a roadmap that they can use going forward.
Thanks, Craig. I'm back online. Apologies, there were slight issues with technology, but fully back online now. So just to go through this first segment then, as we set the scene, just set the context, and just talk about what is happening. And I think we don't want to go through this in any great detail because it's just setting the scene. I think we move on to the next slide. What I'd like to cover and just talk about is I think we're all aware, particularly in Brazil right now, of the flurry of activity and knowledge that's out there following the recent Brazil Clean Company Act. So this is very topical. I think everybody on the call is in some way involved with compliance. And so the whole idea of the Brazil Company Act, the Clean Company Act, it's quite well known, I think, to people. the elements of what go into making a good, effective compliance program are something that is very embedded in the law and in some of the guidance that's there. So what we're talking about, the subject today of third-party monitoring and assessing and dealing with third parties is right at the heart of the Act, and really that's why we're talking about it. So, and what we've seen related to this is other legislation that's out there, particularly the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act now, and of course a lot more activity going on in terms of enforcement and in terms of collaboration between the various authorities that are out there that are charged with enforcing legislation that's there. Is it real? Is it just new laws that don't get applied? Absolutely not. And this table that we present here, I think it will be some of these names will be familiar to people. The point of this table is really to say absolutely that the law is not some theoretical construct. It's being applied. It's happening in real time. And the way I kind of describe this is everybody in the corporate side of things needs to know this stuff because it's a real and present danger. And so there's some very familiar names there. We won't go through them. Suffice to say these are very recent. The numbers are increasing. The amount of cost to companies, the penalties are going up, and the rate of enforcement is increasing and accelerating. So, and of course what these numbers don't pick, big as they don't capture is the disruption and the reputational damage that goes alongside some of these. So suffice to say this is real. If we move on to the next slide, I think the big case that everybody's aware of in Brazil, I think everybody on the slide has probably heard too much about this case. All of the points here is information that's out there in the public domain, from The Economist to the Wall Street Journal, etc. There's nothing new here. Suffice to say, this is a big deal for Brazil. Its reach is quite extensive, both for the company involved, but for many other participants and individuals. And of course, this thing's ongoing. And again, what's not picked here is all those other companies that are in some way affected by the ongoing nature of this thing. So a number of companies that perhaps have been involved with companies that are alleged to have done things, and now having to look at, well, what are their processes and procedures in terms of assessing third parties, because perhaps they weren't as strong as they might be because they've been dealing with companies that allegedly have potentially been involved in some of this stuff. So this is, suffice to say, it's a big deal. The whole area of bribery and corruption, and in particularly dealing with your third parties. Not only is it at the center of the new act and is it at the center of the FCPA, it's actually very real in terms of some of the risks that have been uncovered right now in Brazil.
And related to that, Martin, just to follow up, is if you look here, there are actually new investigations being launched by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and Department of Justice, because any activity that involves third parties located in the United States, even if only money flowed through a U.S. bank account, suddenly they become liable against the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Yeah, indeed. So what we want to hit on very, very quickly here is just thinking about third parties. And obviously all of you and your businesses deal with a wide range of third parties. But it's important when you evaluate it from a corruption standpoint that you think on a broad basis. Most people focus, of course, on sales agents or sales agents that are dealing with the government or obvious ones. But if you think about this, there are so many other types of third parties that are dealt with that could be a conduit for corruption. In some countries, attorneys and accountants is a channel. In other places, it might be equipment dealers that you're working with. The idea here is just to think about the range of third parties that you deal with, and then, as we'll go into in a minute, start to think about the associated risk that each type of third party would have in your business dealings with them. So what we're going to get into now is some of the meat of what we want to talk about with you. And we want you to think about what is an effective anti-corruption compliance program consist of. And the work that we do at CREATE, we looked at a lot of the international guidelines. We worked with different organizations and companies, and we really boiled it down to 7 specific things or 7 specific categories that make up a good program. I'm going to quickly go over these with you. And if you start with policies, procedures, and records, of course you need the policies. What are the rules that you have in place? But beyond that, what are the procedures? How do you expect people to follow the rules? And finally, do you keep adequate and accurate records to show that people are following the rules? So this is really foundational. When we look on a global basis, what we see is a lot of companies get to the policy stage and they don't do a lot beyond that. They kind of hide behind their policy statement, and that is not a very sufficient way to protect your organization. The next thing we look at would be the anti-corruption compliance team. Here we're looking at who's in charge of the program and is there any kind of cross-functional input, because an effective program needs to be practical. And to make it practical in your company, you have to be able to get input from various departments so that it works within how they need to operate. Because business units will always side toward doing the business as opposed to trying to be compliant if it's a really an awkward program for them to run. So you want to be practical, and the way that you do that is by involving cross-functional input as you're building your program. Next would be the risk assessment. Where is your risk? You can't cover everything equally, so you have to identify where you're going to put your resources, and the way that you do that is through conducting a risk assessment. Next would be management of third parties. And this is sort of the classic due diligence area and the contract area. Are your contracts sufficient and specific to provide protection against corruption? And then, are you conducting any due diligence prior to the contract that would allow you to see if somebody was a high-risk organization to deal with? The bottom 3 categories are really foundational to making the program work and to make it grow and evolve over time. So one is training and capacity building. We can have great policies and procedures, but if we're not running a training program, they're not going to go anywhere. This is how the ideas, policies get communicated to the employees. Next would be monitoring. What actually happens with the program? Do we monitor it, or do we just put the policies in the drawer and forget about it? This is the area that we see as the weakest area on a global basis. And then finally, corrective actions. What happens when a problem is found? Do we just try to stop the bleeding, or are we actually looking to see what caused the problem and find ways to try to improve the system to prevent it from happening? Easy example, if you see that there's routine gift giving in excess of your policy, what happens? Why is that happening? What is the root cause? Is it poor training? Is it an unrealistic policy? If you dig down that one level, you're able to see what is causing that kind of routine problem, and then you can try to fix it. What we do in the system that we're working and providing with PwC is we look at the maturity level in each of those 7 categories on a scale of 1 to 5. And the only thing I want to highlight here is that a goods management system is very specifically about developing the system and implementing it. So as you look here, what we see at level 3 is the system is getting to be better developed, but it's not constantly implemented or consistently implemented. That means that the people may not always be following the procedures. We see this in a lot of global companies, that there's a huge drop-off between headquarters and regional offices or field offices in how they follow the procedures and meet the policies of the organization. So this is the maturity levels that we look at, the 7 categories, and think in terms of maturity in each of the 7.
Okay, so coming then onto the final component, the third and final component of our talk today is really is how you go. It's the how and the practical side of putting into practice some of those aspects of what are required that Craig just went through. And really we're talking here about three different stages of this process. So assessing risk, undergoing some form of due diligence that's appropriate to that risk, and then the kind of the more difficult aspect in some ways, or the part that I think some companies have more trouble with, which is the actual ongoing monitoring. So I think I can move on to the next slide. Yeah. So and this slide just shows that 3-part process. There is a box there, the second box along the right, which is to try to introduce some form of internal review after the risk assessment, because we want this, the whole idea of this is, and to make it workable and to gain traction, is that it's got to be appropriate and proportional to the reality of the situation. So to the extent that we can introduce some element of interpretation and right sizing and commercial input, that's really important. At the end of the day, we want to make a process that fits regulation and fits what's required, but is fit for purpose and to address the risk and to add value to the company. So this is not a mechanical exercise. This is a thinking, living exercise. There's a need for input there. And the real time for that is all through, but particularly after the risk assessment, leading into due diligence. So when we're talking about the due diligence then, what are some of the, how do you go about that? How much is due diligence? It's a good question. How much should you do? And of course, there's no right answer for that. I think the best answer I could give is it very much it depends on the level of risk. So, and where real informed thinking, I think, needs to come in, anywhere in this process, it's in assessing the risk level. It's having a good, mature, and involved assessment of the real risks that the company faces in relation to its third parties. And for this, we try to advise clients and to suggest that some high-level thinking goes into this, because the more, the better the fit of this, the more real it will be, and it also it means that we're in a much more efficient process in getting where you need to get to. So, we like to suggest that some real experience and some high-level thinking should go into that. What a lot of companies do is they maybe have, 2 or 3 or whatever number of level of due diligence that's the right fit to the level of risk. So here's an example. A number of clients would do this. They would have, say, 3 levels. A level 1 type of due diligence would be relatively limited, restricted really to getting information on that third party that's just out there, that might be on public databases, it might be in newspapers, it might just be what you can get from without too much effort or without needing any kind of inside information or any information that's from a more discrete source. Level 2, one level further on, where you're actually probably needing to do a little bit more informed research, a bit of screening perhaps, a little bit more intensive level of input and thought needs going into that. And then really we'd expect to go to level 3, where there's a huge amount of level of effort that really is an investigation. It's from getting information to actually investigating, much more involved. And we would expect that would be, level 3 would be relatively few examples where that would be needed. You would expect based on the risk assessment. But that's one way of doing it. What tasks and procedures goes into each of those levels would need to be tailored to the situation. But we see a lot of cases where this kind of level 1, 2, or 3 type of due diligence is undertaken, not just in this type of exercise, third-party due diligence, but indeed in a lot of other types of due diligence as well. In the financial side of transactions, we see this type of thing. And it's a case of not a hard and fast science, but the idea is to try to screen these things so that you are maximizing efficiency. Of course, due diligence sounds great. Do we really have to do it? We often hear clients say, could we kind of, it can be expensive, it takes time. Can we have a less involved kind of way of doing something like this? Our answer to that is, well, of course you can. You can do much less and have it less specifically done. But there's huge risks with that. And I think, going back to the comments that Craig had earlier, and I think I mentioned that the Act, the Brazil Clean Company Act, very much is centered, as is the certain aspects of the FCPA, that because of the risks that are inherent in third parties, it is actually expected of a properly functioning and inclusive compliance program that you will do due diligence, not that it's something that's, we may do or it's nice to do. Very much moving towards it's kind of expected. And you only have to look at many examples that's out there that, not only do you sort of have to do it and it's expected, but if you don't, the risks are starting to be real. And we put one case here on the slide, the case of the boat case. I won't go through all the details, but suffice to say, this is a very well-known brand with a very good reputation. They got involved, as it happens in Azerbaijan, in a bid, a privatization bid, where they were dealing with a consortium. Now, they didn't do anything at all. They did not make any bribes or help anybody to make bribes in any way, but they were involved with this consortium, and it was there were allegations and indeed subsequent determinations that bribery was paid by elements of that consortium. And even though this entity did nothing more than be part of the part of that consortium, they were that particular individual was in fact jailed. The company was fined, and this was tremendous damage to the reputation. Now you could argue, but they didn't do anything, and I think that's the point. They didn't do anything. They should have done the due diligence, the kind of thing we're talking about, to understand the business partners whom they were dealing with and how they were operating and what their reputations were, because it's them who represented the whole members of the consortium, including this party, which had a very good reputation, and of course that then soiled everybody who's part of that consortium. A very good example of that, and there's many, many others. And so suffice to say, again, this idea of the need to do due diligence is very real. The question, I think, is not should you do it, it's how to make it efficient, how to do it properly so it fits, it fits your business, and it's something that is seen actually as actually, in the end, adding value, not just something they have to do. Just moving on to the next slide then. We mentioned then that you need to be doing this due diligence on third parties, and you need to be very alive to the red flags that are out there, because like a lot of work in this area, none of this is rocket science. A lot of it I describe as commercial common sense when you think about it. And as long as you apply a business mind to this and go into it with an open mind, a lot of it is quite straightforward if you have the right mindset. And I think that's what the acts and all of the acts in this area are trying to get you into, is that kind of the right mindset. So we just grouped together here some of the kind of red flags that we see time and time again, and that anybody in this area of compliance should be really alive to. So we grouped these by three buckets, really. The kind of things you might see in contracts or not see in contracts, some of the background or environmental issues affecting companies and their reputations, and some of the behaviors that might be there or might not be there. So I won't go through all of these, but for example, a red flag is obvious. If someone's not going to sign a contract, then that should immediately send huge red flags, no matter what setting it is. Don't mind that we're in this setting of trying to understand bribery risk. These days, audit rights, the right to audit your third parties is becoming increasingly important. So if somebody will not allow themselves to do that, then we're seeing a lot of clients now just refusing to do business with them. If they're not prepared to open themselves up for an audit, and we're not talking about a detailed audit, we're talking about the audit of a third-party type audit. If they won't do that, probably our advice may be better to stay away. Background issues are kind of obvious. Kind of goes without saying that before you get into business with someone, you probably want to have an idea of what their reputation is for ethical behavior. We're seeing this almost, I think almost all clients we deal with now kind of get that, but there's still some out there who may have heard some not very good things, but still for some reason want to get in the contract. Maybe maybe they feel the product is so good or so unique or whatever. But that's an easy one. It's not hard to get an assessment of an ethical background of somebody. Equally, if somebody is coming to you but they're clearly not experienced, that's the first level of due diligence which we expect anybody to be able to do, is to get an assessment of what is their experience in this field. And there's many, many others that are just kind of obvious, but sometimes the obvious doesn't get done. So red flags, and of course if you cover these red flags and there's still problems, then there'll be some element of mitigation and some element of due recognition that you went through to try and assess these things in the final determination. We're not talking about remediation in this talk, but that's the case. But if you haven't done this very obvious first line kind of assessment of red flags, then it's very difficult later to try to get much sympathy should there be a problem. So, of course, having identified red flags and flagged them, the trick then is to do something about them and try to resolve them. And of course, and again, some of this stuff is quite obvious, but it needs saying and it needs to be built into some kind of coherent plan. So, we see it all the time. People identify gaps in contracts that don't include, for example, the audit rates. That's very simple. Introduce those terms. There is pushback, and I appreciate this from wanting to have to redraft or introduce terms. It's easy if the will is there. It's easy to do, and if that's made as a condition, as continuation of the contract, most third parties are now realizing that you can't just deny that. On compliance reviews, get stuff on paper that the third party actually is compliant. It's not foolproof. They could just be making it up, but it's an extra level of diligence, if you like, which you can then test should there be need to test such written verifications. We're saying that on monitoring's great, but sometimes it gets a little bit obvious, and perhaps the frequency of it is such that companies know when you're coming and what you're going to do, and they might therefore be able to, let's say, hide certain things. So do more of it, and maybe be a little bit more, less systematic, a little bit more serendipitous in how you might do that. So maybe some spot checking. That never goes down well, but as a risk and mitigation device, it's huge. If somebody doesn't know when you're going to come, or they've got minimum advanced knowledge, it's a tremendously powerful tool within this canon of what you've got available. And of course, training, capacity building, kind of goes without saying throughout. So I think suffice to say then, in terms of assessment and due diligence, these are very practical things. It's commercial common sense that you're applying, and you're doing it in a very systematic, methodical, and ongoing way to make this effective in the real world.
So what we're going to talk about now is we're going to zoom in and look at the idea of how would you build an effective monitoring program. So within your overall anti-corruption program, what happens to build that monitoring piece? And different companies that we've worked with come to this at a different starting point. So as I go through this, each of you think a little bit about where your company is related to monitoring and how it could be enhanced. Some companies that we work with have zero monitoring in place. They just don't do it. So they're starting from the beginning. But if your company has some pieces in place, let's think about how that could be broadened or made more systematic in how you do it. So first, of course, is to assess the risks, because you're not going to start by monitoring everything all at once next Monday morning. You have to pick what you're going to start with, and you want to do that against your risk. So if you are providing, one company that we worked with was selling heavy equipment to the government in a country that was extremely high corruption risk. So that obviously, those people that are making the sales to the government of the heavy equipment are in an extreme risk level for corruption. So that might be a place to start with monitoring. Each of you need to look at your own business. We're working with a beverage company in another country, and their risk was around licensing. They needed to get licenses in each municipality. Very high risk situation for them. So what I advise you is to start small and pick one specific area within your company that's high risk that you want to start to monitor. Next would be to develop a monitoring protocol. And that really is, a protocol is simply a checklist of the steps that you're going to go through when you conduct the monitoring. You want consistency, and that protocol is what provides the consistency. So it might list things like how many interviews to conduct, or what documents to look at, or how frequently it's done. But it's really a set of instructions and a checklist for conducting the monitoring. Next, of course, would be to define the roles and responsibilities. Who's going to be doing this in your organization? And this you want to pick carefully, because the people doing the monitoring need to have some independence from the area that's being monitored. You want to make sure that they also have the authority to do it. Even if it's an internal issue, you want to make sure that they have the authority to be going into other parts of your company. If you're doing third-party monitoring, you need to make sure that you're getting the support from the business units that are dealing with those third parties. Next, we want to think about the proper skill set. And now if we think back to the 7 categories that we talked about, this really becomes a training issue. Do the people have the right skills to be able to do the monitoring? And it doesn't have to be elaborate training. It might be 2 or 3 hours worth of training where you just help them to identify red flags. There can be very simple, small steps that you can take to try to help to build up a proper skill set in the group that's going to be doing the monitoring. Next, again, would be to plan the exercise, whether it's internal or external. This would be done based on our risk. And then the other thing, a tip I would give you, is that, see this third point, define roles and responsibilities? This goes back to the idea of cross-functionality and getting buy-in from different departments in your company. So another thing I would do is I would plan the exercise to make sure it involves the internal department where I have the most buy-in. You want to make it more likely that you're going to succeed. So if you have 2 departments, one of which is kind of opposed to this exercise and thinks it's a waste of time, and another that understands the importance of it, start out by going with the internal group that is more on board and is in agreement with what you're trying to accomplish. Next would be to document the process. And as part of this, as you start to plan the exercise, you'll be going through and identifying some specific things that you're going to be looking at. And we'll go into that in a little more detail in the following slides. But along the way, you want to document the process and come up with a report from this, because this becomes a critical piece in your overall compliance program. The report's valuable internally for sharing with boards or other independent bodies, but it's also very important should there be an investigation. Because the first thing that the outside parties will come in and look at is, what is the quality of your anti-corruption compliance program? And some of the things they're going to look at your procedures, they're going to look at your risk assessment, and they're definitely going to look at your third-party monitoring and your internal monitoring. So it's important as you go through it to document it. It doesn't need to be long, but it does need to be documented. And then finally here, the idea of corrective action. Any good monitoring report is going to discover, typically will require things to be done. You'll find things that are not in conformance with what the policies are or what the procedures are. So you do want to identify those corrective actions that need to be taken, who's responsible, when is it going to be done, and this goes back to one of the other 7 categories that we talked about, is the idea of the corrective action program. And whether it's just a surface level or is it actually looking below the surface to look at the root cause of what's causing that problem. That's, again, why I really strongly recommend that you start your monitoring program initially in a very focused area and not start it too broad. It's much better for you to succeed in a focused area than fail with a broad monitoring effort. So then, once we start conducting the internal monitoring, what we're going to start with is looking at the review of the policies and procedures to understand what is supposed to be happening. And we've been doing some work with companies and then their regional offices. And I'll tell you one quick story. One headquarters that we dealt with felt that their 7 regional offices would be at their level, that everybody was running the anti-corruption program at the same level as headquarters, that it was working effectively. What we found is that only 3 of 8 regional offices even knew they had an anti-corruption program. Now imagine that, the shock at headquarters. You're thinking everything's covered, you're sleeping well at night. You find out that they don't even know you have a program. So you want to start there with the review of the policies and procedures. Then, as with any kind of audit program, you're going to interview people. And that's one of a very important information collection mechanism is through the interviews. You'll review documents. You're going to be testing the program compliance across all 7 of those categories. So even though it's focused, it might be in one business unit, you want to look at all 7 of those categories of the program to make sure that they are being well implemented. And finally, Martin's going to talk to you a little bit about testing transactions and how that would occur within the monitoring program. Oh, sorry. I'm supposed to do this one. So interviews first. In identifying the interviews, you want to pick a sample set of employees. And there's some very simple questions you can ask around their general knowledge and understanding of the program. You want to find out not only are they aware of the policy, but do they understand what they are supposed to do? And that's where there's a lot of drop-off, typically. You want to also go into senior management and ask them some very specific questions about their function and how well the anti-corruption program is embedded in what they do. And finally, it's very important, I'm going to come back to this again, to include cross-functional teams so that you're able to get input from different areas like finance or legal or HR so that you're able to get their input and see how well it's being operated or implemented in each of those functional areas. That's another thing that's really critical from the interviews is if you do it in a way that is sort of non-threatening and you're really looking to try to learn and understand and work with the people as opposed to it being an interrogation, we find that you'll learn a huge amount about what actually happens. And that's what we want to do with monitoring. We want to see what is actually happening so that we're able to address it and we're able to try to improve it going forward.
And Craig, can I just add? I think you make some very good points there. I think on the interview component of the compliance and the monitoring that we're talking about, in my view, I'd say I think all components, including the transaction testing, the policy review, all of them are important. I think, in my experience, where I've seen this done well, or where we've helped clients to do it, I would say that the interview process, certainly in the early stages of when a program is being developed for third-party monitoring, perhaps it's the most important, in my view. I think they're all important, but I think for the reasons that you say, the insights you get of how well understood policies are and what really happens. In some ways, there's no other way to get that information than through well-done interviews. And the need for, like you say, non-threatening but insightful and interviews where you're connecting the dots, being very aware of the documentation and perhaps being aware of what the evidence of compliance is in terms of documentation is there. The piece that really transforms it into a learning exercise that can make it effective is the process of doing those interviews. And sometimes I see companies, when they're starting to put programs together, probably downplay that. I don't fully appreciate just how important that component is. And I would say it's possibly the most important component, I would say.
I agree completely, Martin, and how you conduct it and set it up is really critical. If it's done in a way where the person feels threatened, or that they feel that if they don't give the, quote, right answer, that the interview becomes a kind of a worthless process. Whereas if you go in and say, there's no right or wrong answer. What I really want to understand is, what do you know about this program? And what do you actually do on a day-to-day basis? How does it involve your job? That is a way that I think you get tremendously valuable information.
Yeah, agree.
So just to wrap up, before we go into the next part, is what you're really wanting to do, again, is you want to test for compliance with the elements of your program. And that, again, gets to why I think you should start with a relatively small scale. Either pick an issue like gift giving, pick a business unit, but don't start too broad. Start in a more narrow, focused way. You'll think that you get a lot more mileage out of it and are more likely to succeed, and then use that as the basis for expanding the monitoring program. The red flag idea is one that I think is a great way to go, because you're then able to train people that don't have to become experts, and they are able to be trained in identifying like the top 5 red flags. So that's something else that I would really advocate. And then again, both from your internal standpoint, but also in terms of any possible investigation, if you show that you followed up on red flags, that is a big positive. J.P. Morgan Chase in the United States was waived of any criminal charges by the Department of Justice because they had a very well-functioning anti-corruption program. They had all the steps. They had the policies. They had training with records. They had risk assessments. They had all of the parts of an effective program. And when the Department of Justice looked at it, they said, clearly, this is now, we can determine that this was not a corporate issue. This was the rogue activity of a few individuals. Everybody knew what was right and wrong. You as a company have done everything. That's what we want to steer you towards.
And just to add to that, Craig, is the comparison there with the earlier Bork case is really quite amazing, because in the case that Craig has just said, the J.P. Morgan case, the company, somebody at that company was proven and in fact admitted to paying a bribe. Yet the company that person worked for was not fined and was not admonished. In the Bork case, nobody from that company paid a bribe, yet the company and the entity was severely admonished, and there was jail time and there was a fine. And the difference is amazing when you think it's all because of the very strong compliance program that on an evidential basis was clearly there in the former case. And of course, in the second case, there was no due diligence. They didn't do anything to see who their business partners were. And in the end, even though they didn't pay, it cost them quite dearly.
Good point. So, Martin, I think now we're going to go into a little bit more on the documents and transaction testing. Over to you.
Right. Thank you. So, as Greg said, as part of what we do, the interviews are there, the understanding of policy and procedures are there. A key component, though, always has to be there has to be some element, we think, of a good process of looking at some transactions with that third party. So, how do you go about this? Again, how much you do depends on, it's going to be very much baked into the level of risk that you've got with that particular entity. But essentially what you're looking at is always at the higher risk types of transactions that might be. And these are, again, not rocket science. It's quite obvious what typically they are. And as we are talking about bribery risk here and the risk of corruption, then interactions with government or the public sector rank quite high in the segment of transactions we might look at. Cash payments for any reason, and really generally any payments to third parties, and it's the third parties that Craig took us through earlier, the agents, the vendors, the consultants, etc. And of course, specific categories of transactions are in themselves higher risk. I mean, it's kind of obvious. So gifts, the travel, the meals, the entertainment, the things that we all know are there and could be abused, very much has to feature in a risk-based review of transactions. Charitable donations obviously kick in, and one that I see, in Brazil, making political donations and contributions is something that is out there in the business domain, has to be looked at to see the level and who and how and what's behind that and what procedures will follow. In doing this, typically you try to not only zoom in on the higher risk type transactions, but you can't look at everything. So you've got to have some sensible way of coming up with a sample so that you are trying to not be formulaic, but you're trying to get at, in the real world, if somebody was going to do something and put something through any of these components of transactions, how might they do it? And you've got to apply that kind of, keep coming back to this commercial common sense, that reality, putting yourself in the shoes of somebody who might be wanting to hide something. How and where might you do it? And have that very skeptical, that healthy skeptical approach as you're designing this. You don't need to look at everything. You need to have a reasonable sense of where risks are and apply a sample-based risk approach. And of course, moving on to the kind of documents you're going to be looking at, you're going to probably want to know, well, in terms of our third parties, how did we even start with them? How did we, who proved these? How did we, let's have a look at how we even started doing business with these. Does that follow our procedures? Is that in line with our procedures and policies? When there have been payments to consultants in some way linked to the third party, either directly or indirectly, what was the basis for that? How high is that? What's the normal way that such transactions might flow? Does it seem right? Does it smell right? And I think over time you get a really good sense of what the boundaries are of when something is on the right side of something that's sensible or not. And of course, you're going to be looking at the kind of contracts that are in place, and both from a business perspective and from if it's a project-related type relationship. You're going to want to know what is in place there. Do we have those? Are those conditions for that party complying with good compliance-related activities? Do they allow for audit rights, etc.? So you're going to be looking at beyond the actual process, the transaction, the record processing transactions, to the underlying the contracts, and indeed any even correspondence could even, if that's on file and available. And you're going to look at prior monitoring reports. How have we done in the past? Hopefully there are some. If this is starting now, you can't do that. But you're looking and trying to build up for a mix of documents. Does it seem to stack up? That there's reasonable evidence that we can use, should evidence be required, to show that we've done a reasonable job given that it's not easy to do this and it's an ongoing process. So, kind of trying to sum up this aspect, if you like, of the what you might look at and how you might look at it, trying to get at what an entity has in place in relation to its third parties. Just coming back to the points Craig said, so policy procedures, they're not just made available, but they are actually being implemented. You'd be amazed how often somebody's got a great policy in place, in theory, or on file, but when you look at it, actuality doesn't meet what theoretically is in place. And of course, you want risk assessments to be properly done, do the due diligence, and then have those other aspects of a compliance program that really reinforce this specific aspect of the third-party stuff. So you'd expect hotlines to be there. That kind of goes without saying now. Almost all well-functioning companies have some form of reporting, whether it be a hotline, some kind of speak-up process that encourages bad behavior to be reported. And of course, all of the legislation, both in Brazil, FCPA, UK Bribery Act, is really hammering away at the need for ongoing regular training that's evidenced has been applied to regularly and to new employees. That's really got to be there. It's not just enough to do it, it's got to be documented in who was there, so that this stuff goes on and on and on in terms of into the future. A couple of words as we come to the end of this part. I realise time is moving on. And this was in response to a few questions about I've been asked quite recently by clients actually as to there's a lot of talk of third-party assessments. When and how might that translate into some work being done on the site of the third party? I think it's a very good question. So we put this, Craig and I put this slide together just to try to say a few words about that. So first of all, is it a common thing? Is it done a lot? This kind of work done at the third-party site, the business party's partner site? The answer is increasingly so these days. Yes, it is. So, and it may well be done through as part of a audit right process. It might be you might get someone else to do it for you. We are asked quite often by clients who are not so used to, who are not perhaps based here or have limited resources here, to do some of this type of assessment for clients. So we are seeing it becoming a much more common feature of the armory, if you like, that's there to look at third parties. How is it done? Well, it can be there's a level, it can be relatively informal, or it could be a little bit more formal. It very much depends. I think that if the right to a site visit and a third-party audit right is built into a contract, then how you do that is often not so detailed in the contract. It's kind of provision is there, certainly from the experience I have, how you do the scope and frequency may not be so explicit. So there's an element there of, often there's an element of an ability to negotiate, discuss with that third party how that might be done. In other cases, depending on the situation, it could be very formal with very regular timings and very clear scope. It very much depends. Whatever it is, the trick is to make sure both parties don't just sign up to it, but you make it happen. And I've seen examples where the more formal process works very well. I've also seen examples where a more informal site visit and that might change in time from one visit to the next also works very well. It's very much dependent on the nature of the relationship, the openness of the relationship, and what's required in the scope. I think if you're the party doing the assessment and you get across your point of view of what the scope needs to be, if there is some leeway, then if that's a strong relationship, then often that carries through and there's no issues there. I would say companies don't particularly like this, quite understandably, but increasingly in Brazil and in the region, but particularly in Brazil, we're seeing now that it's becoming more of the norm. It's not the absolute norm yet, but it's becoming more of the norm. And so companies getting more used to it, more comfortable with it, and these things seem to be happening more regularly now and to better effect. And of course, at the end of all of this, the idea is it's a process that we kind of need to do, but there's value in it. But we've got to have some evidence that it's been done. It's not enough, unfortunately, to do these things with no evidence. So the monitoring report is an output. What matters is that it's done and there's value, but we need to see a report. It doesn't need to be a huge thesis by any stretch, but it just needs to be reported such that there's evidence should that be required. But not only that, such that evidence can then be shared with the right stakeholders in the business, and to the extent that there's any remedial plans need affecting or investment needed or more resource obtained, that there's some backup for that to take to senior management and maybe take to the board to get that investment and to get the weaknesses addressed. So it's very important. It's not the reason to do it to have a document. The reason is because of the requirements of the law and the business needs and the reality of not doing it. But the end product is there to then help take forward any risks or developmental needs to get the business to where it needs to be in this particular aspect of risk management. And this is the kind of final slide, in a way, of this practical aspect of what we've been talking about. And we also added this slide because of a recent discussion I had with a couple of clients at a conference function. And I would say, well, that's great, Martin and Craig, all this stuff's great, but in the real world, is it happening, and what do you really see? And I think we've tried to ground the whole of this discussion really in the real world. There is guidelines, there's law there, and I think we really try to say to you and try to share our experience that everything we've said is informed by and grounded in what real clients are really doing now. So, so are companies doing this? Are more of them doing than fewer? And the answer is absolutely yes, they are. So the idea, I think, now is very much embedded in just about all companies that I deal with, that they are doing this stuff. The frequency of doing it depends. They can do it, some of them are doing it once a year, some are doing it quarterly basis with the whole range. Depends on the risks, it depends on the sector, depends on the business needs. Who's driving it? Often it's people within compliance who are the owners of this, who are driving it through. So the answer is yeah, we are seeing it now, and I think between us, I'm quite impressed with where it's going. We're not there yet. There is a need to continue this and to reinforce it, particularly where there's need for companies to do a little bit of more resource allocation or investment. But it's not a bad start, I think, is how I would summarize that.
I agree with that, Martin. And one of the things that we've developed together with PwC is a way to take a small step into benchmarking and then improving your anti-corruption program. So the work that we do with companies, we start out by having them go through an online assessment that helps them to understand the maturity that they have in each of those 7 categories on a scale of 1 to 5. Because you can't really improve what you don't measure. So that's a way to start the measurement process. From there, we then would conduct an expert evaluation where some of our experts would get on the phone and conduct interview and document review, and that generates a second score. From that, we work together with PwC to start to develop an improvement plan that would look at what's happening today in your organization and prioritize where you could start to make improvements that would be most practical and most efficient. Again, we want to look at ways to try to reduce your risk in an efficient way. And we also have produced a guide, 200 plus pages with contract language, checklists, other resources, monitoring protocols, a whole host of resources that are provided to you so that you don't have to start from ground zero. You're able to start by using resources that have already been developed and are really reflect the leading practices of what companies around the world are doing. So this is really the first part of the program that we jointly developed with PwC. And then after that improvement plan, that then leads to PwC working to develop a roadmap and a workshop. And I'll let Martin comment on that.
Yeah, I absolutely. We and this process we're talking about is actually over a very short period of time, and it's a very limited, in some ways, a kind of it's a process that takes. There's not a huge resource-intensive or cost-intensive process. We would, based on the results that Craig has said, which often give a very, very good snapshot and a very accurate snapshot of where you are. The idea would be to just overlay that with some kind of with a workshop, get the right people there over 2 or 3 hours, is to then talk through in a very interactive way. You know, what is coming out of this? What are the views of the key stakeholders and the key management in that compliance, in that risk area, but wider than that, and really get that feedback, share the results, discuss that. And then get a first order roadmap of where the company may need to then get to. So as Craig says, they've taken the first step, and they've got an idea, a positioning idea of where they are, where they need to get to, and where they take that, where clients take that, very much up to them. And often that's something that they do internally. Sometimes they may need help. But it's very much up to them. And what we're seeing is that this kind of first step, this diagnostic, if you like, is something that clients really like to see, because it's something that really plugs them in now to something where they know they need to be proactive.
And I think that's the key, Martin, is to try to help companies go from being reactive to proactive. And this is a great way to start that process. And if you look back to what we hope that you took away from this in the monitoring, that's another way for you to start thinking about how to become more proactive. You have to understand what is going on in order to be able to try to make any improvement. And that's the function of that monitoring piece that we discussed earlier. So with that, I know we've gone a little bit over time. Martin, are you able to stay on for a couple minutes? I think we do have a couple questions that have come in.
Yeah. No, I'd be very happy to. I think it'd be great to look at questions.
Okay, and then for those of you in the audience, if you have questions, you can send them to us through the chat function in the window that you have. But we have a couple that have come in. Let me start off with the first one, Martin. First one was, we have a limited budget for anti-corruption. Do you have any ideas on how we can start monitoring without spending a lot of money? So I'll take a first stab at that, and then I'll pass it over to you. What we would suggest is that you look at which functions, which people in your organization are already doing some type of related monitoring, and give them some training on red flag identification. So they might be monitoring third parties, they might be monitoring your field offices. Look to see who is currently doing that in something that is somewhat related, and then give them that extra training on red flag identification. It's a great way to get it going at a relatively low cost.
And I would add to that to say that I think by just thinking about this as a concept, the monitoring, the reality is in a lot of organizations that there's already a lot of knowledge of a monitoring kind of persuasion that's there on companies and entities you do business with. And it might be in different pockets of the business, and often it's not joined together and put together in a coherent way. So I would suggest that as a first off, when thinking about even putting together a team that might do monitoring, is to think, well, where is some of the knowledge in the business about some of our business partners, and just get a group together to share thoughts already on what's known. Let's put together a list, if you like, or compile together what do we know of some of our business partners. You can be amazed how full that might be already. It may then also mean that you don't have to do so much. It might be out of date, it might not be, but by putting together what is known, often that surprises a lot of companies because knowledge is not often done like that. It's often compartmentalized and can readily and easily, quickly, and at almost no cost be harbored together to great effect.
Another question that came in was, what can you do when an important third party pushes back on providing documents or agreeing to your anti-corruption policies?
Shall I take a first go at that?
Yeah, go. Go
okay, this is a great question because this is very practical and very real. And I think in the past, you go back 4 or 5 years, companies would say, well, we'd like to do this, but, business reality wins out, so we defer to them. We don't want to lose that supplier for whatever reason. I think the reality now is that, and of course, just because they're an important supplier, let's say, or the relationship's important or long-standing or whatever, that's not going to cut any ice, unfortunately, with authorities when they're looking if there's been some abuse somewhere along the process. So the reality is, I think companies now have to push back. I think they have to have the courage of the conviction, and this is a very real situation where business reality might well come up against the desire to do the right thing or to do the better ethical thing. I think our suggestion, my advice would be that you've got to sit down with that particular supplier, explain that this is not something that we really have much choice on. It's not so intrusive. It's not so unusual. It's very much in line with guidance behind the various regulations and laws, and it's something that's beyond any one person's power to just not do. And hopefully we'll phase this in, but it also is protective of them, and that this is in no way a negative thing. There's no cost associated with it. It's all best business practice, and unfortunately, it's something that you kind of have to push with. Is that what I would say? I think you've got to push back.
I agree with that, and I think that depending on the relationship, of course, you can use the carrot to tell them that you are planning to provide more business to those companies that improve their compliance. Or you could use the stick and just say, look, both of us risk going to jail and paying significant fines. And I don't want to take that risk, and it's not just me, it's also you taking that risk. So I think some balance of the carrot and the stick is always a good way to try to move it ahead. One final question. I know we've gone quite a bit over time, but we'll take one final question is, we have thousands of third parties, and many could be considered high risk. How do we manage it all? And what I'll say here is, I think this is a great example of where some kind of broad online assessment, like what we're doing with PwC and Provide, is a great way to start with that. Because it gives you the ability to get a lot of information, to get some information on the compliance program of a large numbers of companies relatively easily and effectively and efficiently. And from there, it helps to supplement your risk assessment. So ultimately, not only would you have the typical risk elements like country risk or type of transaction or relationship to government officials, but you have another risk factor, which is the maturity of the anti-corruption program at the third parties. And because it starts with a self-assessment, that's really very scalable. And then we can selectively do expert assessments to supplement that. And it gives you a great way to get a good picture of what's going on a large supply base.
Yeah,
Martin,
I think I absolutely agree with that. I think it comes back to you've got to be sensible about seeing what needs doing. You've got to reflect the business reality, but also there's resource. You've got to be smart in using your resources here. And I think as long as you do all of those things, then any assessment of what you do will be seen in that light. But I think to the extent you are in that situation with thousands of suppliers like that, then this idea that Craig's saying, this self-assessment and getting scalability, is a heck of a great way to get a really good view of the landscape quickly, from which you can do more.
So with that, we're going to wrap it up. We appreciate all of you attending. We appreciate you staying a little bit long. Hope you found it valuable. And we, as I mentioned, there's a recording that has been made that we will distribute along with the slides. And if you have any questions, please get back in touch. And that's it from my point of view. Martin, over to you.
No, just thanks, everybody. We really appreciate you taking the time. We do value your support for these initiatives. There will be the next one will happen in due course. We will be circulating details of that in due course. And again, we try to make these practical and relevant. We'll be very much listening to clients about what the topic might be. So please look out for the next email invite, which will be happening in due course. But thank you for all of your attention. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.